has come to dissolve the IMF. Now, I want you to choose your next words very carefully. Where is Hunt?
Hello, and welcome to Film Rant. In this episode, we review Mission Impossible: Rogue Nation. I wasn't going to do a review on this, but there hasn't been much out in the cinema lately that interests me enough to review it, so I thought I'd fill in the void with this. As usual, this review contains more spoilers than a Facebook feed after a Game of Thrones episode. So, if you haven't seen the movie or want to avoid spoilers, stop watching now. Not that I don't want you to watch it, I need some of your sweet sweet love, but I also don't want to ruin your life because, let's face it, spoilers can drive you to suicide. Usually I talk about the characters at the start, but if you've ever seen a Mission Impossible movie before, we all know what the characters are like. Ethan Hunt is a committed and talented action hero who is a little reckless and has a certain sex appeal and charm, because, you know, it's Tom Cruise. Basically, he's more action hero than action man. Simon Pegg offers all the comedy relief as the Q-style character, the guy who knows all about the tech and incites plans to take down the villain. Hawkeye is in this too, but not that much. He's the face of the MIF and Ethan's superior and commander. Alec Baldwin also stars as the government dickhead, which we've seen 1,000 times before. Basically, all the characters are typical action film characters. They're all good, and they're all typical. The only new additions left to discuss are the villain and this really hot chick. But we'll start with the villain first. Solomon Lane is the head of the ghost faction known as the Syndicate. They're basically a global network of rogue agents set up by the British intelligence who stage terrorist attacks in order to usher change. Nobody knows they exist, except for a certain few characters, including this guy, who confused the hell out of me, because if you don't see much of him or Solomon Lane, you can assume they look very alike and think that they're the same character. They aren't. There was a few times where I got a bit jumbled up in the film, but that was more my fault than the film's. Anyway, the villain character is actually quite interesting. His actions and persona are everything you're used to seeing in an action movie villain. He's gruff-voiced, he has less respect for human life than Superman, and he has a face you just want to smack the shit out of. What separates him though is his motives. He's not in the job for the money, he genuinely wants to incite change worldwide. He wants to be the puppeteer that directs the path of the world. Yeah, he has a bit of a power complex, but it doesn't seem that it's egotistical. It seems he wants to help the world, but his methods are just that batshit insane that even Mr. Scientology thinks he's mental. The only issue I have with him is that we don't see enough of him, or maybe that's the film playing off the fact that he lurks in the background pulling the strings. He's an interesting villain, because he outsmarts Tom Cruise at every turn, and it was a joy to see his plans in action. Isla Faust, a British intelligence agent, is one of the more interesting characters in the movie. She never loses the sense of mystery that surrounds her. We're introduced to her as this big mad bastard is about to torture Ethan, but she helps Ethan escape and then goes back to the enemy. When she's with the enemy, she convinces them all that her letting Ethan escape is all part of a larger plan. Then with Ethan, she says that she stays with the enemy in order to help him, as part of a larger plan. This goes on throughout a lot of the film. Even after you buy that she's on Ethan's side, she'll do some questionable action that puts the doubt in your mind again. She's very powerful, very clever, and probably the best character in the movie. Now we'll jump into the script. Firstly, I'll jump right in and say something that I loved about Rogue Nation. And that was that there was absolutely no romance story. They had plenty of chances to get Ilsa and Ethan on all fours doing unspeakable things, but they resisted. One of the biggest drawbacks in all action films for me is the romance element. If I want to see a guy and a girl fall in love, then I'll go and watch a fucking Hugh Grant movie. No, I want to see Tom Cruise tear shit up and make running look awesome. Now I understand why writers put romance in action films. I'm sure many fellas wouldn't mind seeing some of these women get it on. But in my personal opinion, romance in action movies is about as much use as Anne Frank's drum kit. I thought Rogue Nation handled comedy exceptionally well. A good action movie knows when to make fun of itself, and Rogue Nation absolutely does. All Mission Impossible movies do actually. Rogue Nation had just the right amount of comedy and at the right times. The intro of a film is what needs to grab the audience's attention, so this is a perfect place to add a small comedic factor. They do so when Tom Cruise finally reaches the plane and is caught stealing the package on board. I just love how Ethan has a short staring contest with the guard before pulling his chute and ejecting from the plane in glory. Another example comes in the last few moments of an intense and destructive car chase where Tom Cruise asks Simon Pegg if he has his seatbelt on. The car's already as smashed as Paul Gascoigne on a weekday, so Simon Pegg replies, "You asking me that now?" I didn't laugh out loud, but it did leave me grinning like a cat with a strawberry flavoured arsehole. Most of the great aspects of Rogue Nation come from its construction as opposed to its story, but I'll say some of the negative aspects of the script before I move on to the technical side of the film. I thought the plot was a little too complex at times. I just thought it took a little too many twists and turns. It never ever got boring, but there was a few times where I wasn't sure who was what or who had done what. Maybe I'm just thick though. I don't know about you guys, but I just struggled with the plot a little at times. This leads me to say that I also thought the film went on about 20 minutes too long. Don't get me wrong, all of the action sequences are great, and all of the slower scenes are fine to watch too. It's just I think they could have skipped certain parts of the plot in order to condense the film a little more. I enjoyed Rogue Nation, but by the end I was a little glad it was finally over after all the twists and turns it offered. Ghost Protocol was 7 minutes longer, but with that movie I didn't feel it. I don't know what it was, maybe I was just tired or something. I just felt some scenes didn't need to be as long and some of it could have been blended together to form a slightly shorter film that would have been just as good. I know this is an action film, so I get that some of the action set pieces and fight scenes should be absolutely mental. But there's certain things that piss me off with a lot of action movies, and one of them is refusing to add just a slither of realism while compromising just a little bit of the big car flip or explosion. I grew up watching James Bond, so I was used to this as a kid. But when the Bond trilogy hit, that turned action movies upside down for me. The realistic tone, the amazingly choreographed and gritty fights, along with the main character actually sustaining serious injuries made me set my bar for action films a lot higher. Yeah, not every film is a Bond film, but just a small bit of realism wouldn't go amiss. There's a sequence in Rogue Nation where Tom Cruise and Simon Pegg decide they're going to try for the 2016 Car Gymnast Olympics. They reverse their BMW up a ramp, land on the back of the car, and flip from boot to bonnet for about 5 cycles before finally landing on the roof. Now I'm no expert, but I'm pretty sure regardless of seatbelt or airbags or whatever, after an accident of that magnitude, you would be as beaten as a ginger stepchild. When the camera moves into the wreckage, we see Tom Cruise casually sat there like he's just played a really shit game of Cards Against Humanity, and Simon Pegg is sitting next to him unconscious. There is not a single scratch on either of them. Now if this was realistic, they would probably be beyond a salad, stone cold dead. So no, I don't want it to be 100% realistic, but for the love of God, put some scratches on their face or make them bleed. One thing that did interest me about the script was its thoughts on terrorism. The accidents that were caused by the Syndicate were replicas of real-life events, namely the mystery of Malaysian plane MH370, so it made you think that they at least had some meaning in the real world. Ilsa Faust, who switches between working for Solomon Lane and Ethan Hunt, says something that just caught my interest. When Ethan is swearing to defeat and kill Lane, Faust says, "Why don't we just run away? Get out of this mess. There's always going to be another Lane." It's pretty much the same motto as Hydra. Cut off the snake's head, 2 more will take its place. It leads you to think about the war on terror. At the moment we live in a world where ISIS are seen as the main terrorist threat. What happens when they're defeated? Is that terrorism gone forever? Probably not. I feel like that's what the film is trying to take a stab at. Now on to the technical aspects of the movie. I want to talk about the really tense scene where Ethan has to spend 3 minutes underwater with no oxygen in order to swap out a card with one of his altered ones. The card contains a profile for Simon Pegg's character, so that when the profile is added to the database of the system they're infiltrating, he can waltz past all of the security undetected. At first, Ethan has no real issues. He immediately grabs the correct access point for the card and you think, there we go, piece of piss. Just as Ethan is about to swap his gold card for the one that's already installed, he is battered by a mechanical rod and the scene quickly turns into an excerpt from Total Wipeout. Ethan recovers and then proceeds to chase around this golden card like Harry Potter going after the snitch. They mentioned beforehand that any movement will use up oxygen, so move as little as possible. This event is what causes Ethan to struggle. Now we all know that Ethan is surrounded by the glorious defensive system known as plot armor. He basically can't die. But this scene is so well made and so intense that it does convince you for a slight second that he's actually going to completely fail and give up the ghost. He does fail. As he's trying to escape, he pretty much drowns before he can get the door open and drifts away. How the fuck is he going to get out of this, you're left thinking? It's not like they can do the typical action movie thing where he suddenly just regains consciousness and takes a deep breath. He's underwater for God's sake. However, Isla jumps in and sorts him out. She opens the door and the duo escape. That was a fairly plausible explanation for me. It wasn't a cop-out. It was a rescue and revival scenario that actually made sense. It was a great action set piece, which is something all Mission Impossible films excel at. Don't kid yourself though, it's nowhere near as tense and fantastic as the computer heist scene from the first movie, but it's a good scene nonetheless. The best scene in the entire movie, however, comes about a quarter of the way through. Tom Cruise has asked Simon Pegg to come to an opera so he can find the alleged leader of the syndicate. Pegg is to use surveillance and alert Cruise if he's in any danger. Cruise notices a possible assassin there to kill the Chancellor of Austria and tails him. He then eventually notices Isla, and then another assassin in the control room. Ethan eventually defeats the first assassin and acquires his flute gun, because they're a thing. He notices Isla and the control room assassin both aiming at the Chancellor, but he only has one bullet. What does he do? It's very tense and I had no idea how we could resolve the situation properly. Some great outside-the-box thinking leads Ethan himself to shoot the Chancellor in the arm, leading him to fall back and be swarmed by security. This stops the other two assassins from killing him. Fucking gold. Not only is this scene exceptionally well written, it's fantastically constructed and edited. The action and pacing mixes with the opera music in the background. The scene builds along with the opera music too. We even see that Isla is meant to shoot the Chancellor when Nessun Dorma reaches its final note, which then becomes the climax of the scene. Just to make sure you didn't miss it, director Christopher Mcquarrie throws in a nice VFX shot of the camera panning across the musical score to the note at the time of the shot. The whole scene oozes style and finesse, and I fucking love it when I see action scenes like this. Typical of a Mission Impossible film, Rogue Nation contained elements of a heist film. More often than not, the IMF have to steal something at some point in the movie. I bet when most of you think of Mission Impossible, you think of the iconic heist scene from the first movie. There's a section where Simon Pegg, Tom Cruise and Isla are planning to steal a database from a secure facility, the same heist mentioned in the underwater scene. While planning the heist, Simon Pegg lays out his plan, and we see it unfold on screen as he's talking. Edgar Wright does this with Simon Pegg 2 and Shaun of the Dead. Simon Pegg or not, I love this type of edit. It's in a lot of heist films and it's an effective way of showing the ideal form of the plan, because we inevitably know that something's going to go wrong in the final version, so the scene will be different. Christopher Mcquarrie absolutely nails direction in this movie. There isn't too much that seems out of the blue or simply doesn't make sense. Yeah, at times I got lost, but that was just because I couldn't keep up with the double crossing at times, not because something didn't make sense. Before the crew have even planned the underwater heist, Mcquarrie draws attention to Isla's device on her arm while she's in her pool. We see that she was trying to hold her breath for 3 minutes, so when the plan finally comes, we connect the dots. It wasn't absolutely needed, but it did give you the idea that Isla was planning to do it herself, but instead chooses to use Ethan. This makes you wonder why she would want the database, and feeds into that whose side is she on aspect of her character. This is directing 101. Feed the audience enough information, but not too much. For the audience, receiving information should be like having a starter in a restaurant. It's a good way to start the meal, but too much of it and you could end up sick and that'll sour the whole thing. Directors need to give us just the right amount of information, and let us connect the dots ourselves. Leave the pieces out and let us assemble the jigsaw. All the great directors can do this perfectly, and Mcquarrie is no exception here. Now, although it's well directed, Rogue Nation does have a lot of the same old action cliches that make me want to gouge my eyes out with a pickaxe. I've already mentioned the no injuries thing, so I'll leave that out for this point. There's something that most action movies feel they need to do whenever a timer is involved, and that's stop the timer a few milliseconds before it reaches 0. Like it's nearly always 0.01 or something. Go onto a website with a timer and try and stop it on 0.01. It's fucking difficult, but action film characters seem to be pros at it. It's just a really, really annoying trait. If there's even a slight bit of doubt in my mind that the bomb won't go off, then I can be pretty certain it won't. If there's no indication that it'll be stopped, then I'm happy to assume it'll go off, which it normally does. Rogue Nation has this situation where a bomb is strapped to Simon Pegg. Now, like Tom Cruise, he has a certain element of plot armor. I knew the bomb wasn't going to go off. I never even doubted it. So when I saw the scene drag on, I got quite annoyed when it climaxed at the timer being stopped at 0.01, or at least something within milliseconds of that. Just for once, I'd like to see the hero succeed or the villain cave with 6 seconds left or something. Features like this are present in a lot of action films, and watching them is a lot like being teabagged by the dentist. It's an unpleasant situation, but ultimately, I have no control over it. I'll end on just saying that my respect for Tom Cruise has absolutely rocketed since I learned that this plane scene is 100% real. I always knew Tom Cruise did his own stunts, but I thought that this would have been a green screen jobby. To see that Tom actually had to hold onto a plane while it took off and landed, multiple times by the way, absolutely earns my respect. I know stuntmen do this sort of thing on every film and they have my respect too, but for actors to do their own stunts adds a certain level of passion to their work, and well done Tom Cruise for pulling off this amazing stunt.
I'm actually scared of this.
One thing I couldn't shake though was because I'm a big fan of 30 Rock, I could only ever see Alec Baldwin as Jack Donaghy. At any point when he was on I was half expecting him to shout "Lemon!", introduce Tina Fey to the IMF and tell him that the Syndicate is actually the Black Crusaders. Mission Impossible gets a solid 4 out of 5 frames. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to go and see this movie. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Film Rant. This review will self-destruct in 5 seconds.
Found him.